Now let's consider a scenario where we can combine these. So produce portfolios, a notion of diversification. Just initially begin with a second set of figures. All right, not from Samuels et al. This time. I made these up, so you can blame me if you want to. So here, a second set of stocks. And in principle, we could go through the same exercise. I thought we could. Hang on. Yeah, we can go through the same exercise. He did it that way. All right. We could go through the same exercise, plot those individual stocks, and say which is the best. And again, what we could do is use an approach very similar to this to say what's the steepest line. But what we can also do in this situation is combine them into portfolios. And here, a few of the possible portfolios. So we could take two of the stocks, B and C, for example, or B and D. Or we could take three, or we could take four. So all four of our kind of risky shares are risky stocks. So various different portfolios that we could construct from that set of four risky stocks, B, C, D, and E. In terms of what I've done here, each of these portfolios is equally weighted. So again, as simple as it gets, suggestion would be the first one, 50% of B, 50% of C. In the case of BCD, 33 1/3%. So again, equal weighted. And the final one would be a quarter of each. So that's the basic notion, and that makes it very easy to calculate our expected return. So we add up the two returns for B and C, and we divide by 2. We add up the 3 here, and we divide by 3. So the expected return, fairly simple to determine. What we're also going to have, and we know this, is variability. So there's still going to be risk. In terms of the calculation of risk, a little bit more complicated. You can't just add up and divide. Now, I don't want to show you, not today anyway, that calculation. And you wouldn't like it if I did, because the equation would fill up the whole of the slide, okay? But just one thing to note in terms of what partly determines the standard deviation of the portfolio. It depends upon something which is referred to as covariance. That's the extent to which our individual stocks or individual shares move together. The more they move together, the less, sorry, I'll try and phrase that slightly differently. The more they move together, the greater the figure we'd get for our standard deviation. If they don't move together that much, then we get a lower figure for our standard deviation. And what I've done, again, without going into the details of the calculations, what I've done in terms of the construction of our standard deviation there, our notion of risk, is put forward a scenario where they don't move together that much. So the covariance isn't actually that large. And what you can do is look at the implication of that, again, in terms of a little picture. So what I've labelled on here is just our risk-free asset and our full stocks. And then what I've also done, I think I've labelled a couple on the next slide, is shown the different portfolios that were constructed. And what you can see is the risk-return trade-off for those portfolios is much more appealing. So think of the slope of the line again. Gets a lot steeper if we think about the portfolios compared to our individual stocks. So again, thinking forward a little bit, would it make sense for any of us to put all our eggs in one basket and say, I'm going to go for E because I'm a risk lover, I'm going to go for one of the others, when we can actually get a much better scenario as a consequence of considering the portfolios instead.
Yeah. I was thinking, can I apply this if I have one portfolio, the project, example, I have to develop new products. I have different portfolio A, B, C, D. Can I use the same theory to apply to balance my portfolio projects, minimize the risk, take my project which is going to give better return on investment, and the project I will make sure this product development will be more profitable, or this portfolio in comparison to other portfolio.
I guess what you're doing here is reducing the risk for a given return. So that doesn't necessarily mean more profitable. All right? Whether it would work in a different context would again depend upon the extent to which the returns from those different projects were correlated. Now, well, that's the technicality of it. To think through your example, so if you were developing a new product, and you had 4 possible or 5 possible scenarios, but the market for that product was always the same, then you could well argue the risk will always be the same. And so diversified across those 5 won't reduce the risk at all. But if you were saying I'm going to develop this product for this market, and there are certain factors that influence that market, this one for another one, and different factors influence that market, then creating a portfolio could reduce your risk. So, where do we get to? All right, portfolios look much better bet than focusing on an individual than focusing on an individual stock or share, whichever one you wanted to focus on. And that's even more evident if you look at that notion of a line again. So what's the return for a 1 unit increase in risk? Same principle in terms of how I did it here. Slope of the line here is 2.57. And you can see that's a lot steeper than if we were to send a line out to any of the individual stocks that we've got there. So for a given level of risk, you're getting a much better return as a consequence of constructing portfolios, as a consequence of diversification. And again, in terms of the example, it's the combination of B and E that would give us the best return given risk in this particular example. So there's a few figures to illustrate the point. What we can do is take this further, hopefully, if it hasn't jumped up on me. Okay. And establish some principles. So the little example begins to illustrate that as you create portfolios, as you diversify, the risk-return relationship gets better. So risk given return begins to fall. But that doesn't mean, again, as it indicates on the slide, that all risk is eliminated. You've still got some remaining. And this little diagram here is designed to show that notion. So here's our idea of risk. So our idea of standard deviation. And standard deviation of the portfolios. And here, the number of securities or the number of stocks that are actually in the portfolio. And what you can see is that gradually, as the number of stocks in the portfolio increases, risk begins to decline, but only down to some particular level. So the notion is you can reduce this risk, but you cannot completely get rid of it. The risk that you can reduce is quite often known as unique or specific risk. Notion would be it's specific to the individual company, it's specific to the individual share, or it's unique to that company. So that's the type of risk that you can eliminate by diversification. But some risk remains. And that is quite often referred to as systematic risk or as market risk. Studies that have looked at this suggest that you can get around here somewhere, so that roughly all that's left is market risk, by having a well-diversified portfolio of about 25 stocks or 25 shares. So you're not talking, in terms of the practicalities of it, of hundreds and hundreds of shares. A well-diversified portfolio, about 25 is the suggestion. Well-diversified in the sense of not all in the same industry. So various different industries, and you could well achieve that much lower level of risk. So in terms of where we go, and then hopefully the next bit we'll pick up on what you're asking. In terms of where we can take this, the argument would be if individuals can diversify and remove all the unique or specific risk, then there's no way that a market is going to price that risk. You don't have to accept it as an individual, so no way you're going to get rewarded for it, which I think is what it says. If it's not playing up again. Yeah, there we go. So you don't have to bear this risk. All you have to do is construct a portfolio. And the empirical work suggests not a very big portfolio, 25 stocks, 25 shares. And then practically all of that specific risk has gone away. So in terms of the notion of pricing, or in terms of the notion of return, which I've been talking about more, the notion would be that that unique risk will not be reflected in the return. It wouldn't make any sense because you do not have to bear it. So, it's only the market risk side of it that would be priced or would be rewarded in the marketplace. And as the name suggests, this notion of market risk relates to the kind of, well, not just, but it's the easiest way to think about it, relates to the overall stock market and the things that are likely to influence that overall market. So we're thinking particularly in terms of kind of macroeconomic factors. So things like inflation, to pick up on what someone said earlier, exchange rates, economic growth, and so on. So it's quite a strong argument to say that it's only those factors which then have an impact on market risk which are likely to be priced, which will generate that notion of our return. But to come back to the point that was being asked or made a moment ago, the extent to which individual stocks or individual shares respond to that market risk, that can differ. Now that's different than what